My name is Clara Carter, and if you're sitting there right now with a cup of coffee in your hand, I want you to take a slow sip and really listen to what I'm about to ask you. Have you ever looked at the person sleeping right beside you? The person whose breakfast you made, whose late-night rants you supported, whose empire you quietly helped build from a rickety folding table, and realized that to them, you are completely invisible? Not just unappreciated, invisible, like a piece of old corporate furniture that came with the building. Type the word boundaries in the comments right now if you have ever had to quietly walk away from a room just to save the last remaining shred of your own dignity. Because that is exactly what I had to do at precisely 11:42 a.m. on Valentine's Day. I was holding a beautifully heavy, cream-colored paper bouquet of deep red roses, wrapped with a thick satin ribbon. Tucked safely inside the handwritten card was a slim black envelope containing 2 first-class flight tickets to Paris. Depart Friday evening. 4 nights at a boutique hotel near Saint-Germain, the exact same neighborhood where Jake and I spent our honeymoon 14 years ago. Back before his suits were custom-tailored, back before his name started appearing on the glossy covers of business magazines, and back before people in corporate lobbies stood up just a little bit straighter the absolute second he walked into a room. I had spent weeks planning this. I imagined the look of sheer surprise on his face when I walked into the headquarters of Harlow Reed Technologies. But when I stepped into that massive glass atrium, the sheer volume of the applause hit me before I could even see the crowd. There must have been at least 200 employees gathered beneath the soaring skylights. There were gold balloons, white roses, and a violinist playing softly near a decorated platform. And right there, under the glowing corporate logo, stood my husband, Jake. Beside him was Amanda Blake, the brilliant, sharp-bobbed CEO he had hired 18 months ago. Before my brain could even process what my eyes were seeing, Jake dropped to one knee. He opened a velvet box, revealing a diamond ring in the exact custom cut I had once told him was my favorite. The crowd erupted into wild cheers. Amanda covered her face, tears streaming down her cheeks as she nodded, and then Jake stood up, cupped her face, and kissed her. It wasn't a nervous kiss. It wasn't an accidental slip. It was the deeply practiced, comfortable kiss of a man who had already betrayed his wife 1,000 times in his mind before doing it in public. A woman standing right next to me whispered, "Can you believe it? They are absolutely perfect together." That single word, perfect, is what finally made Jake turn his head. His eyes cut across the crowded atrium and locked directly onto mine. For half a second, the entire room seemed to freeze. His practiced public smile instantly vanished. The color drained completely from his face. He knew. He knew I had seen every single thing. And do you know what he did? Nothing. He didn't step off that platform. He didn't run after me. He didn't even say my name. Amanda saw his gaze drop, looked over at me with the polite, confused smile a wealthy hostess gives to a party guest she can't quite place, and mouthed, "Do we know each other?" In that exact metric second, I understood everything. Jake hadn't just cheated on me. He had structurally erased me from the very world we built together. I turned around and walked out before my dignity could bleed out on that polished concrete floor. The receptionist, completely clueless, smiled brightly and said, "Have a great Valentine's Day." I made it to the isolation of my car in the parking garage before my hands even began to shake. I sat there looking at the Paris tickets in my lap, listening to the faint echo of their applause trapped inside my head. I could have screamed. I could have stormed back in there and thrown those heavy roses right at his face. But when rage gets deep enough, when it becomes perfectly clean, it doesn't make you loud. It makes you incredibly, dangerously quiet. I pulled out my phone, canceled the Paris trip, froze our joint marital accounts, and called our family attorney to immediately initiate the withdrawal of my holding company's massive 83% equity share from Harlow Reed. Within 30 minutes, my phone lit up with 152 missed calls, and then the doorbell of our Westport home began to ring. I didn't open the door right away. I just stood there in the quiet hallway of our house in Westport, Connecticut, with my heavy winter coat still on, my purse hanging from my shoulder, and those dead Valentine. Flowers slumped over on the kitchen island behind me. The silence of the house felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the air inside a room that hadn't been opened for decades. If you have ever had to quietly earn your place in your own family, or if you've ever found yourself making excuses for why someone you love slowly stopped looking you in the eye, you know exactly what that silence feels like. It's the sound of reality catching up to a lifetime of beautiful lies. I stared through the narrow sidelight window next to the heavy front door. Jake was standing out there on the porch, his tie crooked, his hair completely disheveled by the February wind, and his face shiny with sweat despite the freezing cold. Behind him, his black company car sat parked at an aggressive, awkward angle in the gravel driveway, abandoned so quickly the driver's side door wasn't even fully latched. For the very first time in 14 years, Jake looked like a man who understood that consequences could move significantly faster than corporate excuses. But as I watched him ring the doorbell again, my mind didn't anchor itself to the panic on his face. Instead, it pulled me back to a memory from 14 years ago. It was 2 a.m. in a cramped, drafty, rented office space above a 24-hour dental clinic in Stamford. The radiator was clanking like a dying engine, the Wi-Fi had just dropped for the fourth time that night, and we were eating cold, greasy takeout directly off the floor because we didn't own chairs yet. Jake had fallen asleep with his head resting against a stack of printing paper, looking exhausted but completely at peace. I remember sitting up under a cheap blanket, typing out the core system architecture for what would eventually become Harlow Reed Technologies on a legal pad. Back then, we didn't talk about market capitalization, or public relations, or institutional credit lines. We talked about building something that actually mattered. We talked about creating software that would make hospital systems safer, protect patient data, and keep small medical clinics from drowning in outdated administrative systems. Jake had the undeniable charisma to sell anything to a room full of strangers, and I had the quiet intelligence to actually build the exact thing he was selling. We were an incredible team once. That is the part people who look at Betrayal from the outside never truly understand. It doesn't start with a cartoonish villain twirling a mustache in a dark room. Sometimes, the person who eventually destroys you is the exact same person who believed in you when the rest of the world thought you were completely insane. When my father passed away a few years into our marriage, he left his initial seed investment to me, which I immediately transferred into a private family holding company called Carter Family Holdings. Over the next decade, through massive funding rounds, strategic founder buybacks, and incredibly detailed corporate restructuring agreements, that holding company quietly grew to control 83% of Harlow Reed Technologies. Jake knew this fact, of course. He signed every single corporate document right alongside me. But as the company grew, his ambition began to harden into a strange, brittle entitlement. He started telling me, with a soft, convincing smile, that investors were simply more comfortable when there was a single operational voice representing the company publicly. He convinced me that my deep desire for privacy was a strategic advantage, that I could guide our overarching strategy comfortably from the shadows of the board level while he handled the exhausting television interviews, the high-profile conferences, and the endless champagne toasts. And because I loved him, and because I naively told myself that a marriage was a partnership rather than a high-stakes competition, I stepped backward into the dark. I corrected no one when business magazines called him the sole brilliant founder. I let him take the credit, believing that my sacrifice was just another brick in the foundation of our shared future. But knowing a legal fact on paper and actually respecting it in the real world are two entirely different things. Jake had spent so many years standing underneath the bright spotlights, listening to the intoxicating roar of public applause, that he had genuinely begun to believe his own marketing materials. He forgot who drew the blueprints for the stage he was standing on. He forgot that borrowed power is never, under any circumstances, the same thing as earned trust. The doorbell rang again, longer and more aggressive this time, cutting through my thoughts like a blade. Then came Jake's voice, slightly muffled through the heavy, insulated wood of the front door. "Clara, please open the door. I know you're in there. Please, just talk to me. Just talk." It was fascinating how small, how fragile that word sounded after what I had just witnessed in the atrium. I pulled out my phone and watched another call from him come in, lighting up the glass screen with a lock screen photo I had never changed. It was a picture of Jake in an old, faded navy sweater, smiling at me from the wooden deck of our very first house. That was before the sharp gray started touching his temples. Before the 5-figure custom watches. Before his boundless corporate ambition hardened into a total sense of entitlement. I let it ring out until the screen went dark. You see, Jake wasn't a cartoon villain. He wasn't stupid, and he wasn't reckless. He was a brilliant corporate architect who managed disasters the way a seasoned pilot manages bad weather. To him, an affair wasn't a moral failing. It was a calculated risk that simply required a superior public relations strategy. He didn't just stumble into a relationship with Amanda Blake. He had meticulously engineered an entire parallel reality over 18 months, creating clean, separate compartments in his life so that neither world would ever bleed into the other. He had systematically trained everyone at the office to think of Harlow Reed as his universe alone, gently pushing me out of the frame until I became an urban legend to his new staff. To the young receptionist with the perfect eyeliner, I wasn't the co-founder or the majority shareholder. I was just a random woman carrying dead flowers on Valentine's Day. But his masterstroke wasn't just hiding me from the office. It was hiding his life from Amanda. He had rented a luxurious downtown apartment, not to live in, but to use as physical evidence of a lie. He had shown her a fake lease agreement. He had spun a masterful, tragic narrative about a long-standing, amicable separation delayed only by complex corporate asset divisions. Every late-night board meeting, every overnight strategy session in Manhattan, every international flight that kept him away from our bed. It was all wrapped in a neat, professional bow. He didn't lie because he was sloppy. He lied because he enjoyed the architecture of a perfect deception. Have you ever looked at someone you love and realized they weren't just lying to you? They were actively rewriting your entire history while you slept right next to them? He had stood in our kitchen that very morning, kissed my cheek, and told me he had a grueling acquisition meeting that would keep him tied up until midnight. He wore the custom charcoal suit I bought him for his birthday. He drank the coffee I poured, and then he drove straight to his own public engagement party. "Clara," his fist pounded against the wood outside. "Please, it's freezing out here. Just give me 10 minutes to explain what happened." I finally reached out, turned the deadbolt with a slow, deliberate click, and opened the door exactly halfway. The biting February wind rushed into the warm hallway, carrying the sharp scent of his expensive cologne mixed with sweat. He took a frantic step forward, his eyes dropping to my face, then tracking down to my heavy coat, before passing completely over my shoulder toward the kitchen island, where the cream-wrapped roses sat like an abandoned crime scene. "Clara," he whispered, his hands trembling as he reached toward me, "please it isn't what it looked like." I stared directly into his eyes, and for one terrible, almost hysterical moment, I wanted to laugh. I realized that even now, standing on our porch with his life unraveling, he honestly thought the infidelity was the only problem he had to manage. He had absolutely no idea that the entire empire was already burning to the ground behind him. "Then tell me, Jake," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any anger he could weaponize against me. "What exactly did it look like?" He opened his mouth to deploy one of his famous practice speeches, but before a single syllable could escape his lips, the phone inside his jacket pocket began to violently buzz. Jake didn't answer his phone. He silenced the call with a quick, irritated flick of his thumb, never taking his eyes off mine. "Clara, we need to talk inside," he said, his voice dropping an octave as his eyes nervously flicked toward the street. Our neighbors' pristine colonial houses sat beautifully manicured behind the bare maple trees, their welcoming porch lights glowing softly against the graying Valentine's evening. Westport was the kind of town where people proudly pretended not to notice things while secretly noticing absolutely everything. And Jake knew that better than anyone. He had spent the last decade meticulously cultivating the image of the generous local tech founder, the doting suburban husband, the visionary leader who remembered everyone's birthdays and sent handwritten holiday baskets to people he barely liked. Being seen begging on his own porch by the town's country club elite did not fit the brand. "Please," he urged, stepping closer so that his coat brushed against the doorframe. "I made a terrible mistake. I can fix this." "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk on the way home, Jake," I replied, leaning my shoulder against the heavy doorframe. For the first time since walking into that blinding glass atrium, my hands had stopped shaking entirely. "A mistake is missing an early flight. You stood on a decorated stage and proposed to another executive in front of 200 of your employees. That is not a mistake. That is a corporate event." His jaw visibly tightened, that familiar flash of boardroom frustration passing through his eyes before he quickly smoothed it over with a look of feigned despair. "It got out of hand." He swallowed hard, his voice cracking. "The momentum of the acquisition, the public pressure, it just rolled in like a storm. It wasn't a conscious choice to hurt you, Clara. You have to believe me." I almost laughed. It was truly magnificent to watch. That was always Jake's greatest gift, and perhaps his ultimate curse. He could make any self-inflicted nuclear disaster sound like unexpected weather. A thing that just happened to roll in from the coast. A tragedy he was merely surviving, rather than a malicious choice he had executed with a velvet box in his pocket. "When exactly did it get out of hand, Jake?" I asked quietly. "Before or after you paid a jeweler $50,000 for a custom-cut diamond ring?" Before he could answer, his phone began violently buzzing again inside his jacket pocket. This time, he instinctively pulled it out, glanced at the glowing screen, and immediately turned the glass face away from me. But he wasn't fast enough. I saw the name clear as day across the top of the display: Martin Keller, my corporate attorney. Jake looked up, the remaining color leaving his face so rapidly it was almost deeply satisfying to watch. Not satisfying in the loud, aggressive way people imagine revenge should feel, but in a much quieter, clinical way. The way a heavy locked door feels satisfying after years of someone walking straight through your house without ever knocking. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice suddenly losing all of its smooth, corporate resonance. "Clara, what did you do?" "I protected what belongs to me," I said plainly. The panic in his expression instantly sharpened into cold, hard calculation. I recognized that look instantly because I had watched it happen across mahogany conference tables for years. Whenever a high-stakes tech acquisition began moving in a direction he could no longer predict or manipulate. "Clara, you can't just pull capital out of the holding company like that," he said, his voice dropping into a stern, authoritative lecture. "There are strict legal procedures. There are institutional obligations. There are operational credit line clauses. There are explicit operational clauses." I corrected him smoothly, cutting him off before he could finish. "And you signed every single one of them 14 years ago." He stared at me as if I had suddenly spoken in an ancient language he used to understand, but had completely forgotten through a decade of pure corporate arrogance. 14 years earlier, when Harlow Reed was nothing but a half-developed medical database, a folding table, and a brand name I had written down on a legal pad at 2 o'clock in the morning, Jake didn't talk about institutional obligations. Back then, he talked about our dreams. He talked about building an architecture that would save lives. He had the dazzling charisma to sell the room, and I had the mind to build the product. But what he completely forgot, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that when my father's initial seed investment moved into Carter Family Holdings, it didn't just give us a financial cushion. It gave the holding company a permanent, unassailable 83% controlling stake in the corporate infrastructure. And more importantly, the proprietary source code licenses were entirely tied to that capital structure. By executing my right to immediately withdraw the holding company's position due to an undisclosed material lifestyle fraud, I didn't just freeze a joint bank account. I effectively pulled the operational spine straight out of Harlow Reed Technologies. Behind him, his phone lit up again. It wasn't Martin this time. It was the chairman of the board. I leaned forward slightly, looking through the narrow opening of the door. "Your phone is ringing, Jake," I said softly. I think the board just realized that the entire multi-million-dollar acquisition pending tomorrow morning just structurally collapsed from the inside out. You should probably take that. Jake's jaw dropped slightly, his thumb frozen over the buzzing screen of his phone. I didn't wait for him to recover his senses. I simply stepped back from the doorway, picked up the black envelope from the console table, and looked at him through the narrowing space. "Does Amanda know the truth now, Jake?" I asked. His complete, heavy silence was the only answer I needed. "Then I suggest you go explain it to her," I said smoothly. "Clara, please." I closed the door gently but firmly, sliding the heavy brass deadbolt into place with a deep, echoing click. I stood there in the quiet foyer, watching through the sidelight as he knocked once, twice, and then finally stopped. A minute later, his car door slammed shut. Through the glass, I watched him sit behind the wheel without starting the engine. His shoulders completely bent forward, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. For the first time in 14 years, I did not know who he was calling, and more importantly, I did not need to know. At exactly 7:30 p.m., I sat down at my kitchen table. I had changed out of my heavy winter coat and into a simple, comfortable navy sweater. A single glass of water sat beside my laptop, where the bright screen illuminated the faces of Harlow Reed's emergency board meeting. One by one, the board members joined the encrypted video call. Each of them looked utterly stunned, deeply careful, and professionally frightened. Then, a final window opened, and Jake appeared. He was no longer sitting in his car on my driveway. He was in his executive office downtown, sitting directly beneath the beautifully framed magazine cover that confidently labeled him the man who reinvented medical data. The video conference began without a single second of the usual corporate small talk. No one asked about anyone's weekend. No one commented on the freezing Connecticut weather. Even the company's general counsel, a man who possessed a notorious habit of opening difficult financial meetings with an awkward joke to cut the tension, simply cleared his dry throat and called the meeting to order. Martin sat right beside me at my kitchen table, a thick legal folder open in front of him. "Clara," he whispered under his breath before the chairman spoke, "answer only exactly what you are asked. Let the documents do the screaming." I nodded slowly, taking a calm sip of my water. The chairman of the board adjusted his thick reading glasses, leaning aggressively toward his webcam. "We have received formal corporate notice," he began, choosing his words with extreme legal precision, "that Carter Family Holdings has completely withdrawn its operational equity, commitment, and suspended all discretionary capital support, effective immediately. Because of the nature of the foundational licenses, this has triggered an immediate technical default on our pending acquisition credit line." The chairman paused, his eyes cutting across the digital gallery. No one looked at Jake's window. Every single eye on that screen was locked entirely on me. "Mrs. Carter," the chairman continued, his voice tight, "can you formally confirm that this notice is authentic and fully authorized?" "Yes," I said clearly, "the notice is completely authentic." "And can you confirm," he asked, his hands folding on his desk, "that Carter Family Holdings remains the sole beneficial owner of the 83% controlling share of Harlow Reed Technologies?" Yes, I replied, my voice steady and completely calm. That is correct. The silence that followed seemed to stretch out into eternity. Several of the newer directors had certainly seen the ownership structure typed out on cold corporate governance papers over the years. But seeing a percentage on a legal document and facing the reality of a human being exercising that power are two entirely different things. For a decade, Jake had successfully become the public face of the enterprise. Employees quoted his speeches. Institutional investors photographed his smile. Reporters called him a tech visionary. Somewhere along the way, everyone in that ecosystem had slowly begun to believe that high public visibility was the exact same thing as actual equity ownership. Jake had believed it most of all. He suddenly leaned aggressively toward his camera, his face twisted in a mixture of panic and corporate authority. "Clara, please," he pleaded on the open line, completely abandoning his professional composure in front of his peers. "Don't make permanent catastrophic structural decisions based entirely on today's personal emotions. We can handle this privately." Martin placed his hand lightly over my legal pad, a gentle physical reminder to remain detached. I didn't need the reminder. I looked directly into the camera lens, ensuring my gaze met Jake's across the digital divide. "I made absolutely no decisions based on emotion today, Jake," I answered with an incredibly even tone. "I simply executed structural legal rights that have existed since the very day this company was incorporated." The chairman turned his attention toward Jake's digital window, his voice turning cold. "Jake, is there anything of a material nature you need to disclose to this board before we proceed with a formal vote?" A long, excruciating pause filled the line. Finally, Jake cleared his throat, trying to regain his footing. "My personal situation has become slightly complicated. There has been a misunderstanding regarding my marital status with leadership." "Complicated?" Linda Foster, one of our longest-serving board members, folded her hands tightly on her desk. "Did you represent yourself inside this organization and to our institutional investors as an unmarried man, Mr. Carter?" Jake hesitated, his eyes darting off screen. "Yes." "Were you, in fact, married to Clara Carter during the entire duration of these representations?" "Yes." "Were members of executive leadership, specifically our CEO, Amanda Blake, aware of your active marriage?" "No," Jake whispered. The digital room became painfully quiet. If you have ever watched someone try to corporate speak their way out of a moral crater, you know that the air leaves the room all at once. But here is what you need to understand. The board didn't actually care that Jake had been unfaithful to me. In the high-stakes world of technology capital, personal betrayals are considered private matters. What they cared about, what made their legal counsel break into a cold sweat, was that the chief executive officer had actively concealed material personal facts while conducting a highly public, structured relationship with another executive inside the company. Corporate governance had just officially become a massive, terrifying legal liability. The general counsel spoke up immediately. "Given these explicit disclosures, I recommend placing Mr. Carter on immediate administrative leave pending a full, independent third-party investigation." Jake looked directly into his camera lens, a desperate flash of anger breaking through his facade. "You can't be serious. I am the operational spine of this company." The chairman sighed deeply, looking older than his years. "I truly wish we weren't, Jake." By 8:30 that evening, the formal news hadn't reached the financial media, but inside the digital hallways of Harlow Reed, everyone already knew. Corporate rumors travel significantly faster than any official press release. Someone in operations noticed Jake leaving the executive floor carrying a single cardboard box. Someone else noticed that Amanda's glass office door stayed closed with the blinds drawn all afternoon. Security quietly deactivated Jake's executive building access card by sunset. The next morning, I woke up after barely 3 hours of sleep. For the first time in over a decade, Jake wasn't lying beside me. The silence in our master bedroom felt completely unfamiliar. Not lonely, just profoundly unfamiliar. I quietly made coffee, fed our aging golden retriever, Murphy, and stood by the large kitchen window, watching the neighborhood children wait for the school bus in the crisp morning air. Life outside my burning world was continuing exactly as it always had. That realization grounded me. My personal world had completely shattered, but the rest of the universe hadn't stopped spinning. At exactly 9:15 a.m., Martin arrived at my house carrying two incredibly thick red folder packets. "The primary lending banks have officially responded," he said as I invited him inside the warm kitchen. "They've suspended the entire acquisition financing package. They're asking whether Carter Family Holdings intends to remain invested in Harlow Reed after a complete management restructuring." I looked down at the heavy folders without opening them. "What did you tell them, Martin?" He smiled slightly, taking a seat at the island. "I told them the absolute truth. I told them the majority owner still deeply believes in the foundational architecture of the company." I looked at him, slightly surprised. "You thought I wanted to destroy it?" "No," Martin said softly. "You never wanted to destroy Harlow Reed, Clara. You built it. You simply wanted to stop one man from pretending he owned the bricks you laid. People always imagine revenge as burning the entire house down. Sometimes real revenge simply means refusing to let someone keep stealing credit for the foundation you poured." But as Martin opened the first folder, his slight smile completely vanished. The look on his face instantly caught my attention. "What is it?" I asked, leaning over the counter. "We found a series of old authorization records from the private equity ledger," Martin said, his voice dropping into a very serious register. He spread dozens of corporate documents across the kitchen table: expense approvals, private equity transfer forms, internal investment authorizations. At first glance, they looked perfectly ordinary. Then Martin pointed a pen toward several signatures at the bottom of the pages. "These are your legal signatures, Clara." I frowned, pulling the papers closer to my face. I never signed these, Martin. I haven't looked at the private equity ledger in over 3 years." "I know," Martin said, his eyes locking onto mine with deep gravity. He slid an authentic signature from my holding company agreement right beside them. The difference became immediately obvious: tiny, almost microscopic structural variations, but entirely obvious under scrutiny. Jake hadn't simply betrayed our marriage. Someone had been systematically forging my signature on highly sensitive corporate and financial documents for nearly 5 years. I slowly sat back in my chair, the cold coffee in my mug completely forgotten. Every single emotion I had been carrying since walking into that blinding glass atrium on Valentine's Day suddenly shifted. Until this exact moment, I honestly believed the story of my life was a standard, heartbreaking tale about a husband's cliché infidelity. But looking at those forged lines, it was mutating into something much larger, much darker. This wasn't just a betrayal of a marriage anymore. It was high-level corporate misconduct, systemic financial fraud, and severe criminal exposure. Martin folded his hands tightly over the folders. "Clara, you need to prepare yourself." "For what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "If our forensic analysts confirm what these documents are hinting at," Martin said with absolute gravity, "Jake isn't just going to lose his marriage. He's going to lose his freedom. He's going to lose absolutely everything." I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. The forged signatures spread across my kitchen table already spoke for themselves. Jake hadn't just crossed a single line on Valentine's Day. He had been comfortably crossing lines for half a decade, thinking his public charm made him completely bulletproof. The engagement party hadn't actually created this disaster. It had merely been the spark that finally exposed the rot underneath the foundation. Around noon, my phone began to buzz on the counter. I looked down and saw a name I never expected to see on my screen: Amanda Blake. I stared at the glowing letters for several long seconds, feeling my heart rate elevate slightly before I finally picked it up and swiped across the glass. "Hello, Amanda?" Her voice on the other end sounded absolutely nothing like it did during our formal corporate board meetings. It was much quieter, incredibly fragile, and completely stripped of that polished executive confidence. Clara, I know I probably have absolutely no right to be calling your personal number right now. No, I answered honestly, keeping my voice steady. You probably don't. She let out a sharp, ragged breath, accepting the boundaries immediately. I didn't know, Clara. I swear to God, I didn't know about you. I didn't know about the marriage. I didn't know about any of it. I believe you, I said softly. He told me you had been completely separated for almost 2 years, she whispered, her voice cracking over the line. He told me the formal divorce paperwork was simply delayed because of complex international business assets. He even showed me an apartment lease downtown to prove he was living alone. That made me pause. What apartment, Amanda? A heavy, painful silence stretched between us. Then she answered quietly. He rented a penthouse apartment on 4th Street. He told me it was his primary residence. I stared blankly at the kitchen wall. Jake had gone so far as to rent and furnish an entirely separate luxury apartment, not even to live in, but simply to act as physical evidence to support a masterfully constructed lie. Every late-night strategy session, every overnight corporate trip, every weekend he claimed he was tied up with international investors. There had always been somewhere else. Not because he needed a place to sleep, but because he needed concrete proof of a parallel life. I feel physically sick, Amanda whispered. You should, I said, though I didn't say it to be cruel. I never would have allowed myself to be put in this position if I had known the truth. I know, her voice broke completely into a sob. I am so incredibly sorry, Clara. For the very first time since walking into the atrium, I heard genuine, unvarnished remorse from someone connected to this entire disaster. And looking out the kitchen window at the bare maple trees, I realized something important. I could have hated her. Part of me desperately wanted to turn her into the monster of my story, because hatred is always significantly easier than facing the uncomfortable truth. But the truth was that the other woman isn't always a malicious intruder. Sometimes she is just another human being standing in the exact same wreckage, holding a different piece of the very same lie. I believe you're sorry, Amanda, I said, my voice completely clear. But sorry doesn't undo the architecture of what he built. I won't protect you from the corporate consequences of this investigation, but I will not punish you for a deception you were completely blind to. Thank you, she whispered quietly. That's more than fair. The next 48 hours moved with the cold, unyielding precision of a heavy corporate machine. Martin brought in a high-profile forensic accounting firm from New York, the kind of professionals who did not ask unnecessary personal questions and never used dramatic language unless a financial ledger absolutely deserved it. They set up their operations inside a heavily secured, locked conference room on the executive floor of Harlow Reed. Their badge access was strictly restricted. The heavy blinds were drawn completely shut, and their high-performance laptops remained open late into the night beside endless banker boxes of old corporate authorizations, wire transfers, and executive compensation files. I did not go to the office. That was an entirely deliberate choice on my part. If I walked into that glass building too soon, the employees and the media would instantly turn this clinical investigation into a petty personal war between an emotional wife and her straying husband. I wanted absolutely no office gossip, no dramatic hallway whispers about a woman scorned, and zero excuses for Jake to claim I was acting out of simple heartbreak rather than concrete evidence. So I stayed securely within the quiet walls of my home, answered targeted legal questions entirely through Martin, and let the forensic professionals do what Jake had always deeply underestimated: follow the paper trail. By the third afternoon, they uncovered the systemic pattern. It wasn't just one or two isolated forged signatures on a handful of documents. It was a beautifully polished, layered internal system. My forged name had been systematically used over a 5-year period to authorize massive temporary executive loans directly to Jake, approve highly inflated corporate travel reimbursements, and fast-track incredibly lucrative vendor contracts tied directly to people Jake knew personally outside the organization. None of it was reckless enough to scream fraud at a casual first glance. That was precisely what made it so profoundly dangerous. It was wrapped in elegant, dense corporate terminology, clean enough to pass effortlessly through the hands of busy administrators. But lies, as I've learned, age incredibly badly. Every single document carried a digital timestamp. Every approval left a hidden layer of metadata. Every single dollar transferred left a permanent electronic trail. At exactly 6:12 p.m. on Thursday evening, Martin called my personal line. "Clara," he said, his voice entirely calm but completely unyielding, "we have more than enough." I was standing in my quiet laundry room, methodically folding one of Jake's expensive white dress shirts, because habit is occasionally the very last part of a 14-year love to fully die. I looked down at the crisp fabric in my hands, staring at the custom monogram stitched onto the cuff, and suddenly felt incredibly foolish for even touching it. "Enough for a standard board termination?" I asked quietly. "Enough for an immediate termination for cause, enough for an aggressive civil recovery action, and more than enough for a direct referral to federal authorities," Martin confirmed. I closed my eyes for a brief second, wishing the truth had been just a little bit smaller, a little less devastating. Then my mind pulled me right back to the image of Jake dropping to one knee under that bright skylight, kissing Amanda while 200 people loudly applauded, a complete and utter lie. "Then send the files to the board," I said. The emergency board meeting was formally scheduled for the very next morning. This time, Jake wasn't invited to join the call as the commanding chief executive officer. He was explicitly instructed to appear as the sole subject of a forensic criminal investigation. Amanda appeared in her video window from her home office, looking incredibly pale but completely composed. She had already formally resigned from any decision-making capacity connected to the company, and the board had accepted it. She did not attempt to defend herself, nor did she cast any blame on me. When the chairman flatly asked whether she had known Jake was actively married, she looked directly into her lens and said, "No. He explicitly told me he had been legally separated for 2 years." "And did he ever disclose to you that Mrs. Carter controlled the absolute majority ownership of Harlow Reed?" Amanda paused, her eyes dropping for a brief second. "No. He told me his wife had zero operational involvement and that the high equity structure was just old family paperwork." That specific phrase landed in my kitchen like a heavy lead weight. Old family paperwork. That was what Jake had reduced my father's life savings, my 14 years of intense architectural labor, and my quiet, supportive silence to. Then, the lead forensic accountant took the floor. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply shared her screen, methodically displaying the forged signatures, the metadata, the illegal wire approvals, and the corporate expense accounts used to fund the downtown penthouse. She showed jewelry purchases labeled as investor relations gifts and private weekend travel booked through corporate accounts. Weekends Amanda genuinely believed were intense business retreats because Jake had surrounded every single deception with just enough meticulous paperwork to make it look entirely legitimate. Amanda covered her mouth with her hand once, only once. Jake sat entirely frozen in his digital window, the city skyline glowing behind him. When he finally attempted to speak, his voice sounded incredibly thin, stripped of all its usual corporate power. "This is completely being taken out of its proper context," he stammered. The lead investigator adjusted her glasses, looking directly at him. "Mr. Carter, digital metadata does not possess a context. It merely has timestamps." I almost smiled. By noon, the board voted entirely unanimously to terminate Jake for cause, revoke every single cent of his unvested equity compensation, and refer the forensic findings to outside legal counsel for immediate civil recovery. 3 nights later, Jake came back to the Westport house one final time. He did not ring the doorbell over and over like a manic corporate closer trying to manage a crisis. He knocked once, quietly, and waited. Through the window, I saw a man who looked absolutely nothing like the confident husband I had bought flowers for on Valentine's Day. His coat was deeply wrinkled, his face was completely unshaven, and his eyes were hollow. The boundless public confidence had drained out of him entirely, and without it, he seemed remarkably small. I opened the front door, but left the heavy security chain firmly in place. He looked down at the brass chain, then up at my face. "I deserve that," he said quietly. "Yes, you do," I replied. "I lost the company, Clara," he whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "No, Jake," I said, my voice completely clear and devoid of malice. "You didn't lose the company. You simply lost the grand illusion that it ever belonged to you in the first place." 3 months after that cold Valentine's Day, I found the original cream envelope containing the Paris flight tickets tucked away inside a deep drawer in my home office desk. The flights had long since been canceled, and the hotel reservation was completely gone. The little handwritten card I had poured my heart into remained folded inside. I read it over exactly once. Then I walked over to my paper shredder, slid the card into the slot, and watched it disappear into tiny, meaningless fragments. I didn't do it out of lingering anger. I did it out of absolute, beautiful acceptance. That very same evening, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and booked an entirely different trip. Same city, completely different hotel, and exactly one ticket. When I arrived, Paris greeted me with warm golden sunshine and lively cafes spilling onto the narrow sidewalks. For the first 4 days, I walked completely without an itinerary. I lingered in old, dusty bookstores where I only understood half the language, and I sat beside the Seine with a hot cup of coffee that slowly grew cold because I was completely captivated by watching the people passing by instead of drinking it. On my second to last evening, I crossed the Pont des Arts just as the sky turned into a brilliant, soft gold. 14 years earlier, Jake and I had stood on that very same bridge, making grandiose promises about our future wealth and success. This time, standing there completely alone with the wind in my hair, I made just one single, unbreakable promise to myself. Never confuse being needed with being valued. They are not, and will never be, the same thing. Nearly a year later, Harlow Reed Technologies formally announced a massive new investment initiative specifically designed to support early-stage healthcare technology companies founded entirely by women and underrepresented entrepreneurs. That exact idea had been sitting inside one of my private leather notebooks for almost a decade, collecting dust. Now, we had finally built the architecture to make it a reality. At the formal launch event, Amanda, who had been fully reinstated as CEO after a thorough independent ethics review cleared her of any complicity, introduced the program to the press. She thanked the board, she thanked the global investors, and then, completely unexpectedly, she paused and looked directly at me in the front row. "Some people build companies," Amanda said into the microphone, her voice echoing clearly through the auditorium. "Others build rare cultures where the truth eventually matters significantly more than appearances. We are standing here tonight because Emma Carter refused to sacrifice either." The applause that followed her words sounded completely different from the roaring applauses I had heard in that glass atrium on Valentine's Day. That initial applause celebrated a beautifully manufactured corporate illusion. This applause honored genuine, hard-earned integrity. The difference mattered more than I could ever put into words. A few weeks after the event, I received a handwritten letter in my mailbox. Not an email, not a clinical text message. A real physical letter. It was from Jake. He wrote to tell me that he had taken a low-level management position at a small, regional software company up in Vermont. It wasn't glamorous. There were no glossy magazine interviews, no high-profile keynote speeches, and absolutely no corner office overlooking a metropolis skyline. He wrote that every single morning, he unlocked the quiet office building himself, made the morning coffee for his small staff, and left every evening knowing exactly what his title truly meant: an employee. At the very bottom of the crisp white page, he wrote one final sentence that stayed with me. "I hope one day I can become someone who is actually worthy of the forgiveness I asked for." I folded the paper back up and placed it inside a small wooden box filled with old photographs. I didn't do it because I wanted to relive the painful past, but because pretending it never happened would teach me absolutely nothing. Some chapters in your life deserve to stay firmly closed, but they never deserve to be completely erased. People online sometimes ask me whether executing my rights and getting revenge finally brought me peace. The completely honest answer is no. Revenge didn't bring me peace. Revenge gave me structural justice. Real peace arrived much later. Peace arrived the exact day I completely stopped measuring the value of my future by the scale of someone else's betrayal. Jake didn't just lose his marriage because of a single afternoon. He lost it because he repeatedly chose deception over raw honesty. He didn't lose his massive career because of me. He lost it because he continuously chose blind ambition over personal integrity. He lost the entire empire because he completely forgot that borrowed power will never be the same thing as earned trust. As for me, I didn't win because he lost everything. I won because I finally remembered that my fundamental worth had never once depended on whether he recognized it or not. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge you can ever achieve isn't aggressively destroying the person who deeply hurt you. It is beautifully refusing to let their terrible choices destroy the incredible person you were always meant to become. If this story resonated with something deep inside your heart today, I would absolutely love to hear your honest thoughts down in the comments below. What would you have done if you had been standing in my exact shoes in that atrium? Would you have made the same quiet choices, or would you have taken a completely different path? Share your unique perspective with me. And if you truly enjoy deeply thoughtful story times about betrayal, structural justice, resilience, and beautiful second chances, please consider subscribing and joining our community for the next incredible journey. Thank you for sitting with me today. Keep your boundaries strong, and I'll see you in the next story.